Hello, everyone. Welcome so much to our conversation on civil discourse. We're glad to see you joining us today. And well, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'm just, again, so delighted to have you all here joining us from all over the world for a conversation on civil discourse. Good evening, everyone. My name is Katherine Turner. My pronouns are she, her. And I'm founding president of Global Citizen LLC consulting firm and co-chair of the programming committee and director at large of the Duke LGBTQ+ network. I'm also an adjunct professor at UNC Chapel Hill. I'm delighted to serve as your moderator for this evening's event, and I bid you an extremely warm welcome. This conversation on civil discourse has really been a long time in the making. Last year, Stephen Petrow reached out to colleagues at Duke, and then they reached out to the LGBTQ+ network about organizing a conversation on civil discourse, and we enthusiastically agreed. We then contacted the other affinity groups to be represented, and they also enthusiastically agreed. We felt it was really important for all four of the affinity groups to be represented and to be able to speak to this topic from diverse perspectives and experiences. And we're really proud to offer this program that provides an opportunity to engage in authentic dialogue with all four of our affinity groups and with our entire diverse Duke community and friends. Authentic is absolutely what we intend for this conversation to be, in that we can and likely will disagree, and we can do so with respect and civility, and that's precisely the point. The goal of this forum is to create a forum for the Duke community to reflect on the meaning, the importance, and the practice of civil discourse, and to share practical strategies for engaging in meaningful, effective, and respectful conversation across differences. In short, we aim to bridge the divides. And I imagine that many of us are acutely aware of the different identities, the histories, the geographies, the political narratives and systems that divide us. As a nation, we're certainly experiencing this, and we're experiencing a stark wake-up call that we're long overdue for a reckoning on racism, systemic racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and other forms of systemic oppression that have created centuries of dehumanization, of untold suffering, and persistent disparities. For some of us, we're continuing to live the daily pain of daily discrimination. And it can be hard to imagine that for some people, they're just waking up to this reality. And we're here to talk about that. And for others, we're facing concepts and identities that are completely new to us, histories that we didn't learn in civics class, and knowledge and feelings that can be uncomfortable and even painful. But like any difficult life experience, if we're committed to our growth and development, there's no way around it. There's only through, and we're here to talk about that. And I would also hope that all of us have experienced the joy of engaging in meaningful connection across difference and the sense of rehumanization and revitalization that creates. And we're also here to talk about that. So today's conversation is an important and timely reflection on where we've been, where we are currently, and where we aspire to be as it relates to civil discourse. And we'll also share practical everyday strategies we can employ to bridge the divide, to connect across differences, and to regain our civility, and in the process, our humanity. So it is my true delight to introduce our esteemed panelists for this evening's program. And I'll start with Dr. Amanda Boston, who is an assistant professor of Africana studies at the University of Pittsburgh. Her research, writing, and teaching focuses on 20th century and contemporary African-American history, politics, and popular culture. She's currently working on a book and other projects on gentrification in her hometown of Brooklyn, New York, and its role in the making and unmaking of the borough's Black communities. Hosea Chang graduated from Duke in 2003 with a degree in political science and currently serves on the regional San Diego board of the Duke Alumni Association and as an at-large member for the Duke Asian Alumni Alliance. Hosea is also a member of the Council of Korean Americans. Jose Antonio Isase Sase is a partner in the Chicago office of the international law firm of Jones Day. He's a member of the Duke class of 1989 and currently serves as co-chair of the Duke University Hispanic and Latino Alumni Association, as well as on the board of the Duke Alumni Association. He's been a leader in efforts to bring diversity to the legal profession for more than 25 years, including participating in numerous presentations and panel discussions on diversity across the United States. And Stephen Petrow, 78, is a columnist at the Washington Post, the creator of the TED Talk, 3 Ways to Practice Civility, and a member of the Duke LGBTQ+ network. His latest book is Stupid Things I Won't Do When I Get Old, which is a memoir and a manifesto about aging, and has just been on the bestseller list. So we're super excited about that for him. And he lives, as my neighbor, in Hillsborough, North Carolina. So those are our panelists for this evening. And again, we're just so thrilled to have them joining us, and we will go ahead and jump right into our conversation. So I'm going to start off with our first question, and Amanda will lead us off. And Amanda, we'd love for you to share a particularly positive experience you had connecting across differences and the impact that had on you and others.
Sure. Thanks, Catherine, for the intro, and thank you for having me. Definitely the classroom has been an incredible place for civil discourse. I guess that's why I stayed in school so long, right? But, people united by a mutual desire to learn more, to be better humans, to think about the world we want to co-create, coming into the classroom, willing to be vulnerable, willing to understand that we don't know everything and that we could all stand to learn something, and really bringing together people across backgrounds to have important conversations. But I think in talking about the classroom, I think it's also important to be clear that we also understand the classroom as a unique space where we can have conversations and ask questions that we can't necessarily have or ask in broader society because things can get so dicey. So definitely the classroom for me.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing that, and understandably so as a professor. And so what we're going to do actually, and I apologize, we're going to kind of revert a little bit over to hear from Stephen, because Stephen is going to provide us with some framing remarks about civil discourse, which I think will provide a good foundation for our conversation. And then we'll continue on with our panelists.
Okay. Well, thank you, Catherine. And it's really an honor to be with everybody here. And I want to thank those at DAAA for all the work that you've done behind the scenes to make this happen. And I've seen just hundreds of people saying hello. And I just want to say hello to Jack Boyd and Ann Newman. Those names are dear to my heart. And so I was asked today to frame a little bit about what we're going to talk about when we're talking about civil discourse. And I've organized it in terms of 4 questions. So the first question is, what is civility? What are we talking about? So professionally, I am often referred to as the civilist, and that's because I've written about civil behavior for the New York Times and civilities for the Washington Post. And yet, I understand that that is a word you're probably not familiar with, and I don't blame you. Civilist comes from the Latin and French. It's from the 16th century, and it means an individual who's trying to live by a moral code. Someone who is attempting to be a good citizen. And then the word civility is derived from it. And the original definition of civility is a citizen willing to give of themselves for the greater good of the community, of the city, of the Commonwealth. So let me just be a little more blunt. The reason you don't know the word civilist is because, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, it is obsolete. Also, you probably noticed that in my definition of civility, I did not mention being nice, polite, or being well-mannered. And that was not part of the definition originally. That's our interpretation. And modern usage equates civility with decorum, with formal politeness and formal behavior. I like to think of the Dowager Countess, that would be Maggie Smith, in Downton Abbey. And she is the epitome of what we think about when we think about civility today. At the same time, that character is representative of every kind of privilege and many biases. But most of all, she's frequently unkind, and that's putting it kindly. So here's one piece of advice as we start off. Don't mistake decorum for civility. Now, question number 2 is this the worst of times when it comes to civility? You may think so. The polls tell us that. In 2019, a major poll found that 93% of Americans said civility was a problem, and that's pretty darn high. Not surprisingly, 3/4 said civility had gotten worse since President Trump was elected, and nearly 80% were concerned or very concerned that the lack of civility in Washington will lead to violence or acts of terror. That was in 2019, so I guess they nailed that. But let's take the longer view for a moment. What's perhaps not front of mind is our history of incivility. In one word, think slavery. In a sentence, think about the Native Americans who were slaughtered in the name of civilization. In the political arena, as bad as it can be these days, in the 19th century, there was plenty of racist name-calling. Politicians were often rumored or called out as being half this or half that. Political rhetoric was also shrill, hyperbolic, and downright mean, according to one historian. And then in 1854, two congressmen got into an explosive argument on the floor of the House that nearly turned deadly. In a debate over a slavery bill, it became so heated that one of them lurched at the other, who reached for the gun in his pocket, and it took a third member to put that down. So far that's not happened in the present-day Capitol, and so far weapons are not allowed in the Capitol, except perhaps on January 6th when that happened. And I probably don't need to mention the history of fatal gun duels. I think most of us have seen Hamilton. So the point I'm making is that while we have reached a low in accordance with the standards of civility we're used to today, this is not an historic bottom. That's perhaps the bad news. The better news, we still have the opportunity to change our political tone, to change our hyperbolic rhetoric and personal behaviors, hopefully before it leads to further acts of violence, hatred, harassment, or bullying. The third question, why has civility become politicized? Indeed, civility has become a dirty word, whether you lean right or left. Often those on the right conflate civility with what they call political correctness, and to them, callouts for civility are very much like what George Orwell wrote about in 1984. He called it newspeak, an attempt to change the way we talk by forcibly changing the language we use. And Donald Trump had famously said before he was elected, "I don't have time for total political correctness." Really? How much time does it take to be respectful or kind? So in short, to the right, civility is often equivalent with censure or cancellation. Now, my friends on the left also have a problem with civility. During the Trump years, those on the left harassed administration officials who supported the president's border wall. You may remember that Press Secretary Sarah Huckabee Sanders was politely asked to leave the Red Hen restaurant in Virginia by the owner, who then believed that Sanders worked for the most inhumane and unethical administration. Sanders, however, called out the owner as being uncivil, and she tweeted, "I always do my best to treat people, including those I disagree with, respectfully, and will continue to do so." Finally, some attention has to be paid to the wrecking ball of social media. To that point, a Pew Research poll last year reported that 2/3 of Americans blame social media for the deepening polarization, specifically the misinformation, hate, and harassment in the country. So finally, the last question, is civility the answer? I sometimes imagine if we had sided with decorum and courtesy throughout our history. I think about the suffragettes who marched and picketed and were chastised and arrested for pursuing the vote for women. Should civility have been the goal? What about equality? Did it when it comes to the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., the father of American nonviolent civil disobedience? He was frequently labeled as uncivil in his attempt to promote racial and social justice. Again, which is the greater good, civility or justice? So let me end with a quote from a new book. It's called Against Civility, The Hidden Racism in Our Obsession with Civility by Alex Zamelin. Civility is an effective way to distract. Saying I'm civil helps insulate you from any criticism that you are promoting injustice, that your choices are hurting others. Your impeccable manners allow you to more readily deny that you have any role in making others suffer. You give to charity. You're a good father. You pay your taxes on time. You are civil. You wear that badge of civility to deny the fact that you turn a blind eye to mass incarceration. that you enthusiastically support political candidates who want to create harsher voting restrictions, that you want lower taxes, even if they devastate poor communities. So, to be civil or not to be civil, that may in fact be the wrong question. Perhaps the question ought to be, or the questions ought to be, what kind of society do we seek? What values do we support? And how do our actions and behaviors help to move us forward? Thanks. Back to you, Katherine.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for those framing remarks. And I think you've posed some excellent questions for us to delve into a little bit more deeply during our panel discussion. So we will resume our conversation now. So Amanda was really highlighting the importance of the civil discourse in the classroom and her positive experiences with those. And so now let's hear from you, Hosea, about your positive experiences. We're hearing about particularly positive experience you had connecting across difference and the impact that had on you and others.
Sure. Well, first off, I'm excited to speak with everyone and with my esteemed panelists. So thank you for having me here. I'm gonna push back a little bit, only in the wording, in that it's, you asked for a positive experience, and I think for most people they'll understand nuance, but for me, I think oftentimes you can find a lot of beauty and quote unquote positive. You can find a positive experience out of messiness. And so this story isn't exactly positive through and through. It's not a Disney, it's not a Disney movie or anything like that. But whereas Amanda talks about the classroom, for me, it happened at the workplace. And I hate to talk about COVID because I know everyone's trying to avoid COVID. But with all the talks with vaccines and whatnot at the workplace. So for us, we have a warehouse, for instance. And so obviously, as you can imagine, people are in relatively close quarters. And so if at all possible, getting people vaccinated is a huge priority. And so our warehouse manager, let's call him Oscar, he's like a little brother to me. We play pre-pandemic, we'd play time basketball, we'd hang out, someone I get along with really well. But Oscar insisted on not getting vaccinated. And to this day, he still hasn't. And we talked about it quite a bit, and I didn't want to push him too hard for a bunch of different reasons. And then at one point, though, a few months ago, we actually got COVID. And so at that point, obviously it was one of those things where I was a bit disappointed, frustrated, all that sort of stuff. And so I remember, obviously you're staying at home. I remember calling him and I said, "Hey, Oscar, how you feeling?" He's like, "Yeah, I'm feeling fine, boss. Don't worry. I'm drinking tea, just like a bad sore throat, like a minor cold, not a big deal." It's like, "Okay, you don't have to go into the ER or anything, nothing like that." He's like, no, definitely not. And then, so at that point, again, like I said, with the caveat that I treat him, he's like my little brother. I said, "Dude, what did I tell you? Go get vaccinated, blah, blah, blah." I started railing on him. And at the end of it, we talked for a good 5 minutes going back and forth. I was like, "Why aren't you getting vaccinated?" And he's like, "I don't believe it." And then, obviously the point of the story is not to go into who's right or wrong here, but simply that let's just agree that, we're on different sides of the aisle here. And so at the end of it though, he said, "Look, at the end of the day, if you want me to get vaccinated because I trust you and because I like you and I care about you, I'll go get vaccinated." And at that point, that was the most disarming comment that he could make, right? Because at the end of the day, for me, it put me in my place and made me realize it's not about the science, quote unquote science, who's right or wrong, at least in this particular conversation. And that at the end of the day, he would just do that for me. And so we ended the conversation. I was like, "Okay, man, I'm sorry. You do what you think is best. Just keep your mask on. Make sure everyone else is keeping their mask on, and let's make sure no one else, no one gets sick at the workplace." And to be clear, it didn't happen at work, in case anyone thinks it happened at work. And so for me, though, what I liked about that story is what was really positive about it was that we still don't agree on that topic. And obviously it's a very volatile, inflammatory topic. And yet at the end of the day, though, I think we came to a better understanding of each other. And so we still came out of it in a much more positive manner.
Great. Thanks, Hosea. So you're really speaking to the importance of building relationship and building trust. And I think that's a key element of civility. Yeah, Jose, over to you.
Thanks. And first of all, let me just join everyone else in thanking all of the people who have joined our presentation this evening. It's really a little intimidating to see such an international flavor to this. And I hope we deliver a good, solid hour and a half of quality discussion to you all. So to understand the impact on me, the experience I'm going to share with you all, I need to give you just a little bit of background on my family. My parents are Cuban, and they came to this country in the 1960s, fleeing Fidel Castro's totalitarian government. It was the defining moment of their lives. In order to be permitted to leave, they had to abandon everything in Cuba. They could take the clothes they were wearing on their backs and what they had inside their heads, and that was it. Now, unlike the experience of a lot of Latinx immigrants in this country, they had one advantage, which was that it was the policy of the government that Cubans arriving in the country qualified for political asylum, and they didn't use the phrase back then, but they had essentially a pathway to citizenship. So growing up, I would describe our family as solidly middle class. My father, even though he didn't speak any English, managed to graduate from university and became an engineer. And we ultimately moved to Winston-Salem, North Carolina. My mother ran our house and raised 4 sons. They actually still live in the house that I grew up in Winston-Salem that we moved to in '76. So I was definitely raised as a Cuban and as a Latino, which was not easy to do in Winston, but frequent trips down to Miami for summers and for holidays helped reinforce our culture, and sitting around in the living rooms of my aunts and uncles and grandparents, listening to Spanish conversations and a lot of eating, all helped me feel very much part of the Latin culture. So on to the positive experience, bridging differences. My parents have always been interested in and engaged in the Hispanic community in North Carolina. In the late 1970s, that community looked very different than it does today. In the 70s, there was always a significant percentage of the folks in North Carolina who were seasonal workers, primarily in agricultural businesses, what some people at the time called migrant workers. Now, I remember one day my parents took me driving out about an hour out of Winston into the fields, and they stopped at a couple very poorly constructed homes right at the edge of one of these fields. And out of the homes came a couple adults. Now, today I can't specifically remember if they were Mexican or from Central America, but they were clearly foreign, clearly Latin, and very poor. And nothing in my up to, I guess I was 11 years old at the time, had prepared me to come face to face with the true poverty of a seasonal field worker. I was acutely uncomfortable there, didn't know who these people were or what I was supposed to do. But my parents started talking to these folks in Spanish, and you could see the immediate effect this had on their body language. They relaxed. They moved from one-word answers to fulsome discussions. Soon their spouses came out and their children came out, and they were talking with my parents. And suddenly, I felt like I'd been transported right out of this very strange and awkward and unfamiliar setting to something I instantly recognized, a Latin family. The rapid fire Spanish, the exuberant use of the gestures, the jokes, that moment made an impression on me that I carry to this day. Even my 11-year-old brain was able to see the connection that existed between us culturally. I could have just as easily in that moment been sitting in the living room of one of my relatives' homes in Miami. What I carried forward from that is that we all have far more in common than we have differences, which we might believe separate us. And I think it's one of the great things about this country, and it doesn't exist in a lot of countries everywhere. We are able to celebrate differences, but we should always remember to use our common experiences to connect across those.
Thank you, Jose, for really highlighting the importance of celebrating differences and forming connections and celebrating our commonalities as well. Yeah. Over to you, Stephen.
Thanks, Katherine. So the panelists are getting some questions, I guess, just directed to us, or some thoughts. And I want to respond to one from someone named Matt, who suspects everyone, now it's disappeared on my screen, but he believes everyone on the panel is left of center, and that we don't believe civility should be applied equally when it comes to issues of the left and issues of the right. Personally, I can't speak for other panelists here, but I do think consistency of the definitions that we're talking about and how we approach all of these problems is really, fundamental to bringing us together. And so when I was talking about different definitions of civility before, I probably should have made clearer that, any acts of hate or aggression or bullying, regardless of, who is, behind them, are highly problematic, whether from the left or from the right. So I just wanted to respond to that, Matt. And I think, the story that I've been thinking about in terms of this question. So I do a lot of reporting for the Washington Post, and I've been a little bit on the kindness beat the last couple of years, such as it is. And actually during the pandemic, we've heard a lot of the, 600,000 deaths and all these infected. But if we go back, we can remember to what happened in New York City at the very beginning with people coming out at 7 o'clock and, clamoring for the firefighters and the first responders. And there were really so many ways that the good came out in us during this very dark time. And sometimes that can be hard to see because darkness casts the shadows. So I also did a story on this book that talks about the viral nature of kindness. And I had written about this and I'd read about it. And basically the theory is, if I did something nice for Amanda, whatever that was, she would be more likely to do something nice for someone else in the next month or two. It wouldn't necessarily be the same thing, but it was documented in these studies at Stanford. Though, Amanda, you probably just already do things nice for everybody, so you're not a good test subject for this. So I had written about it, and then one day I was at a bakery, and known for its scones. And there was a long line, and I was like number 20, and the scones were disappearing sort of one by one. And then there was one scone left, and there was one person in front of me. I was like praying in my head that she did not take a scone, and she did not. She took a croissant. I was like, yes. And all of a sudden I hear the man behind me say, "That's my scone." And, I turn around and then he says, "I've been waiting online a really long time." Now he's behind me. So he's been waiting online like at least 1 minute longer than me. What I said really surprised me. And I grew up in New York City, so I have a little bit of that edge. But I think, this theory about the viral nature of kindness came out because I said to him, "I will share that with you." And I was shocked. And then he must have been shocked by what he said because, okay, I'll get a croissant and share that with you. And this happened like in real time. There was no thought going into it. We each did that. We sat down. We literally broke bread. We had a long conversation. We had nothing in common. We had absolutely nothing in common. But this experience, helped to forge, an understanding in that moment of anger, that they kind of opened us up to other ways to find a common ground. And for a long time, we stayed in touch, and it's kind of guided me as a way that this kind of virus can also replicate itself, and this is the kind of virus we want to be replicating.
For sure. For sure. Yeah. And so much connection does seem to happen over food. So thank you for that. Yeah. Breaking bread metaphor. All right. So I really appreciated hearing these different experiences. And I just invite everyone who's participating this evening for you all to really reflect on particularly positive experiences that you have had connecting across differences and the impact that had on you and on others. And as Stephen is challenging us, how can we replicate those positive experiences, just understanding the ripple effect that they have? So I'll go ahead and move on to our next question, and we'll be leading off. Hosea will be leading us off. And Hosea, excuse me. What importance does civil discourse hold for your communities that you identify with, our nation as a whole, and the world? We certainly have a global audience tonight. And so let's talk about how this resonates. What importance does it hold?
For me, as a representative, for the Asian American community, I think it really allows us to speak up. I think for something that the Asian American community is dealing with is this myth of the model minority. It's pervasive. It's absolutely destructive. It encourages a lot of us to remain silent and quiet and not do certain things. And I'm not going to hijack the conversation and take it too much over there, but you can Google plenty of that if that's something that's of interest to you. And so for me, I can think of a couple experiences that come to mind as to how this impacts me. For instance, when I was a kid, when I was a third grader, there was this book called it was a series called The Chronicles of Prydain. It's a fantasy series, very like a kid version of Lord of the Rings and whatnot. Very good series. And there was this character named DUHLAA, which was a dwarf. And, we had a school play and we're going to perform an audition for all that. And I remember I wanted to audition for DUHLAA. And I remember someone saying right away, hey, DUHLAA's not Chinese. You can't have a Chinese DUHLAA. And so one, I'm not Chinese. And two, wait, more importantly, it's like, well, okay, wait, what? And what's embarrassing is, like, at the end of the day, I feel like I never really said much, right? I mean, to be fair to my third grade version of myself, it's like, it's hard to kind of really speak up. But nonetheless, the fact that I'm here, I am still talking about this experience like 35 years later, it obviously left an impression. And so I think, and I still see it to this day, for instance, even with my son, he plays club basketball. He's one of the few Asians, and, just the way I can tell, simply put, without going into detail, how he's treated on the basketball court, just because he's Asian. He's not used to being, you're not used to seeing too many Asians out there. Obviously, Jeremy Lin already spoke to this in terms of all the sort of racial comments that he heard when he was playing in the NBA and in the D League as well, and all that sort of stuff. So in my mind, I think this is why civil, again, specific to our community, I think this is why civil discourse is so important, because I think, and to be clear, I'm not saying it's only us that need to speak up, obviously, but the whole point is that everyone needs to speak, I think, directly and in truth. And a lot of the things that Stephen said too, in terms of, at the end of the day, what are we trying to achieve here? What's the real objective? And I keep getting distracted by the chat, but I love the conversation that's happening in the chat, by the way, because there's some good debates. Actually, I think, candidly, the chat's probably more interesting than what I just said. But I think that is such a struggle. It was a struggle for me too, as to because even as I was planning for this conversation, what does civil discourse actually mean? And so I found Stephen's framework very liberating as well, because he reframed it. What are we trying to accomplish here? And I think that's a really, really good question for all of us to ask and consider.
Great. Thank you, Hosea. And similarly, want to acknowledge thanks to everyone who's posting in the chat and having some of your own discourse there. And we will be coming to questions and comments once we hit about 8 o'clock, so Eastern. So look forward to addressing those. And so in the meantime, Amanda, let's move over to you about what importance does civil discourse hold for your communities as you define them, our nation, and the world?
Sure. I mean, I think my communities would be Black, female, ex-working class, all sorts of communities, right? But I think for me, civil discourse is important not just for what it has the power to reveal, right, through sort of polite conversation, but also what it conceals, right? And this builds on some of what Stephen was saying earlier. And I'm thinking specifically about civil discourse as a sort of preoccupation with politeness rather than getting to the heart of the matter. And he, Stephen also quoted or referred to Martin Luther King. And I'm thinking in particular, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, he sort of chastises white moderates for basically their preference for order rather than justice, their preference for the absence of tension rather than the presence of justice. And so I'm thinking a lot about, how civility and the preoccupation with civil discourse, how we need to sort of think about, okay, well, does the level of conversation that we're having match the reality? Does it reflect, is everyone playing nice while, there's rampant poverty, there's still segregation, there are health inequities, right? And I think that if we call that civil discourse just because we're playing nice, we're actually doing ourselves a disservice.
Agreed wholeheartedly, Amanda. Thank you for really bringing up that issue about kind of authenticity, and that what we're really talking about here isn't nice, and nice can be such a cover for people's kind of true emotions and true sentiments. And so how do we get to the heart of that, of authentic, a real authentic exchange? All right, well, Jose, over to you and hearing your response.
Thanks. So first of all, let me chime in. The chat is just amazing, and I am hopeful that we're provoking some of this in a positive way. And I'm going to actually try to fold in a couple of responses, some of the things I've seen in there in this answer. I want to pick up on a point that Stephen made earlier. I think we have to first define what civil discourse really means. I saw one of our attendees actually ask that question, and I've heard Stephen previously quote Dr. Carolyn Lukensmeyer. And here I'm paraphrasing, that civility doesn't mean avoiding important differences. It means talking about those differences with respect. So, right, so that's not the same thing as politeness or decorum, although that's fine, but both of those can be used as a means to hide respect. So I want to chime in on what Hosea was saying. You know, one of the ways that the absence of civil discourse manifests is in the use of labels, and it's not helpful. I really don't like labels. They're often dismissive, and they are usually intellectually lazy ways to avoid having to do the hard work of understanding someone else. And for the person who was wondering about sort of the tilt of the panel, let me just be clear, at least with respect to me, and I'm not speaking for anyone else, it's not okay if a label is being used to frame members of the majority or the power wielding groups. It's no more acceptable to do it that way. It's no more okay to call someone a Karen than would be to call someone a Jose or a Pedro or some other name that attempts to superimpose on that person broadly generalized and negative characteristics. Not that I think that anyone should come up with any negative characteristics associated with Jose's or Pedro's, but the reason that and the importance that it holds for the community that I want to focus on is our next generation. The kids are watching. Children, young adults, they have seen the last 4 years, and we, the adults, have not been distinguishing ourselves. And they're modeling our behavior, and at times it does not look pretty. A lot of the language that gets used in conversations where you aren't respectfully discussing differences can be weaponized. And if we don't show them the way to talk about our differences constructively, we're going to create generational obstacles to real progress on so many of these issues. So to me, that's the importance. It's not even just what's going on now, but 5, 10, 20 years from now, based on what we're doing today.
Yeah, thank you, Jose, for invoking the next generation and the effect that uncivil discourse has on our children and on future generations. Okay, Stephen and Jose has also done a great job of kind of weaving in some of the comments and that are happening in the chat, and invite everyone to do the same.
You know, Jose, you reminded me of a point that I wanted to make, and I think it was going to slip by me. But as a columnist, and I write with a perspective, I used to use a lot of labels, and I realized a little bit later I was being lazy, just as you said. And so I would, accuse someone of being misogynistic or homophobic or transphobic or racist. And, they're kind of big fancy words. And I realized that they really did not have much ability to persuade anybody of anything. And so several years ago, I was writing about the assassination of Harvey Milk in San Francisco and George Moscone. And Dan White was the man who shot and killed them. So instead of calling him homophobic, which would have been one word, I decided to describe what he did. He went into City Hall with a loaded gun. He shot 5 bullets into the mayor, and then he went into Harvey Milk's office and shot him with a number of bullets. And so I described the scene, and I described the motivation that he later gave to the police, and that turned out to be a much more convincing way to talk about what actually happened and to use storytelling and also sort of personal stuff in that. So I think that's kind of important that we all stay away from the labels, those on the left and those on the right, who are very quick to call others a snowflake or a libtard or, much worse than that. And then sort of switching paragraphs, in terms of what's important to many in the LGBTQ plus community, I think we're really focused a lot on language these days. And 4 years ago, I would have said, there was a lot of attention paid to the phrase, "that's so gay," which was used as just sort of a slur against anybody for anything stupid. And gay was then being, made to be equivalent with, stupid or mean or whatever. And now the language is getting, sort of more evolved. And, we're talking about non-binary people. We have cisgender, we have transgender, we have queer, we have LGBTQIA. And, in a way, this seems like alphabet soup. But in another important way, this is about identity, and this is about listening, and this is about respect. And I'd be the first to admit, like when the phrase or the acronym BIPOC started to be used a couple of years ago, I kind of stumbled with it. I needed a learning curve to understand what it meant and how to apply it. But it was so important to so many of the people that I worked with and was friends with, I made that effort. And I think that's what we do for people we care about. We make the effort to understand their world, even when it's different from our world.
May I also chime in? Because I also want to sort of engage with Jose and the what I think is a rightful concern about labels. But I also want to just be sure that we all understand that all labels aren't equal, right? And so I think civil discourse and power are related, right? So specifically, for example, the Karen instance, right? And so when I think of Karen, I don't think of a condemnation of all white women, right? I think of it as a word that becomes a shortcut for describing a historical occurrence through which white women have weaponized XYZ to cause harm to people of color, right? And so I think it's also, as we talk about the importance of language and the fluidity as it changes over time, I think to just say labels are wrong outright, I think we lose some of the nuance that we need in terms of addressing civil discourse and also understanding how ideas are communicated.
Amanda, it's a great point. Labels, there are lots of things that are labels that are not negative, right? I mean, and there are labels that fit. And when you're talking about it like a historical event, there are labels that fit. The concern I have is when we're talking about civil discourse, if you invoke that, what you do is, unless you know the person, right, you don't know how they're going to react. And at the end of the day, if we're about, as I've seen some of the people in the chat, if we're really about in civil discourse listening and understanding, I've always found it better to sort of not use loaded language that has a tendency to evoke responses from people, and give them a chance to sort of hear the idea, which we can disagree with, before we get to sort of the person. But you're absolutely right that there are phenomenon, there are things that have happened that can be labeled. I just prefer not to then ascribe those labels to people.
Interesting distinction there. Describing a phenomenon and kind of the shortcut for describing a phenomenon, and then what that means when we apply that to people, individuals. But Amanda, we do want to hear more from you about the importance that civil discourse holds for your communities, our nation, and the world.
Well, I think as I mentioned, getting civil discourse that really facilitates that is really grounded in love, respect, improving society, as Stephen said was the original meaning. I think if we're striving for civil discourse, that's wonderful, but we've got to get to, the things that make society hard to navigate, whether that's inequality in whatever realm, right? All of that is part of the quest to have civil discourse and to co-create a better society.
Right. So really invoking some of these questions that we're ruminating on around the point of, is the point civil discourse? Is the point equity? Is the point justice? Kind of what is our ultimate aim here? All right. Well, we've already started talking a little bit about strategy. So we've talked about the effect of labeling on civil discourse. So I'd really starting with Stephen, what are your most effective strategies that you engage to respectfully and effectively engage across differences? What has really worked well for you? And then we'll hear from everyone else.
So I'm going to not answer that question right away, because I see there's a lot in the chat about what do we think about social media and its impact on this entire conversation of civil discourse. So I'd like to go there first, and because I think that it is a distinguishing element in the level of incivility that we have these days. And when I was making taking the long view of history, what happened in the 19th century was very local, and it might have been at best reported in a newspaper. What happens today, spreads and is in rooms that really have no limits. We have the anonymity factor. And then we have also the fact that we have become practiced, unfortunately, in being in these silos and just talking to people like ourselves. And then when you're put in a space, whether it's a metaphoric or a real one, we really challenge to have conversations that involve listening. Because we're used to just doing all caps on the phone, and then I've made my point, and if you disagree with me, I have blocked you, and I've moved on to the next thing. And so I think that is a real challenge. It's certainly increasing the polarization that we see, and I think the hate and the bullying, and I'm not sure of what the solutions are. Last year or 2 years ago, I was sort of very big on personal responsibility. We all have a role in this, and we can curb how we choose to act in any moment. And I do believe in that, but I think there are larger answers, which I'm still thinking about. We start with the individual. We start with what we can do today to be more respectful, to listen. But these environments really promote hate and harassment, and how do you balance that with free speech and so on?
Great, thanks, Stephen, for weaving in the effect of social media, which really can't be overemphasized here. But you were talking about starting with the individual and remaining respectful and listening, certainly important strategies. Amanda, how about you? What have you found to be your most effective strategies for engaging respectfully and effectively across differences?
It depends on what those differences are, I'll say. So for example, I have my best conversations with people who might come from different backgrounds, but we enter the conversation with a mutual recognition of one another's humanity, a mutual desire to understand and learn from one another. I'll be honest, I'm at a point where I'm not getting in a loud shouting match with anyone. Like, there's a baseline for respect, and if we don't have it, there's a baseline, like I said, recognition of my humanity. And if we don't have that, then you're going to have your civil discourse with somebody else, because it's not, so it's understanding my own limitations, understanding what limitations the other person's might be, and really sort of keeping that mutual recognition at the forefront of our conversation.
Great. And Amanda, you've been so good to kind of keep invoking that notion of really recognizing each other's humanity. And then when there's the absence of civil discourse, often it is as a result of dehumanizing thoughts and actions. So a mutual respect of each other's humanity, maintaining a baseline for respect, and then maintaining healthy boundaries and recognizing when civil discourse just can't happen. So I think those are great strategies. Hosea?
With a panel like this, oftentimes I think some people might want or might expect us to have like a silver bullet. But like many things in life, I think sometimes it comes down to the basics: eat your vegetables, get exercise, that sort of thing. And I think that also applies here. So the three things for me, also given again what's kind of being discussed in the chat, and unfortunately it's going so fast I can't read everything, but one thing is I'm going to be even more direct and blunt in saying that I don't really have too much hope that there can be that much or any civil discourse happening on social media. So just any sort of mass platform, I think that's a non-starter for me. I think the second point I'd make is it's super important to be direct, actually, in my mind. And even, this might be a little controversial, but even if the views are a bit inflammatory, because I think you need to express yourself and figure out what it is that you believe in, and have someone push back on it and tell you why you're wrong, and naturally just kind of debate those things out. Because otherwise you're going to just think that there are other reasons why there are always going to be other extraneous factors as to why, that you don't believe, or why you can be considered incorrect. So I think for me, it's like, I love the MLK quote, true peace is not merely the absence of tension, it's the presence of justice. And what Stephen said at the outset that like totally resonates with me, and what Amanda said about the importance of humanity and recognizing that. And that leads me to my third point, where I think in this day and age, especially, and again, I don't want to take the discussion elsewhere, but, with mental health issues, imposter syndrome, with social media creating that sort of that feeling of inadequacy, all that sort of stuff. I think it just comes from the fact that we can see so much more than we were able to before. As Stephen had pointed out, 150 years ago, the medium with the most mass circulation was a newspaper. And so you simply just had such a small view of the world. Now, though, because it's so expansive, I think what we've lost in that process is, simply put, and this is like the eat your vegetables point here, is just engage in more one-on-one conversations. Find someone who's different from you. Like I said, stay away from social media. And one thing that really strikes me, because even when I was growing up, I mean, not that makes me sound old, I'm not, but anyways, point being, in my mind, I was always so obsessed with just getting better about, just get better, just, career-wise, you're always on that rat race, whatever it is. And what I lost along the way that I've recently rediscovered is, have you guys seen Schindler's List? Beautiful movie, very hard to get through for obvious reasons. But at the end, there's that quote where, I think it's from the Talmud, it's someone quoting the Talmud, where someone says, whoever saves one life saves the whole world entire. And that really struck me. It really changed things for me, because it made me realize at the end of the day, you could be talking to someone and you could influence that one person who could then do whatever it is, both either positive or negative. You just don't know. And the point isn't whether or not you're going to know. The point there is, don't think that just talking and engaging with one person who's different from you is not going to have an impact. I think it's really, we live in such a cynical world that we don't believe in putting the time in. We don't believe in doing stuff like that. And it's really unfortunate. So again, this is, like I said, eat your vegetables, but go find someone that you're different from. Go find someone who's across the political aisle, and you'll actually discover, chances are, they're not too different from you. To Amanda's point, don't lose that humanity side. Now, again, I agree with Amanda. If they cross the line, say, if it gets to a point where you need to, you can't deal with it, then fine. And there's a question in the chat of, what happens when you're in a circumstance where it's just really difficult in the moment to deal with that person. I think it's completely fine to disengage. I'm not good at that. Honestly, I'm very reactionary. It's something I'm working on personally. But, it's something, a friend told me this actually today too, in a different context, but it's okay to just say, hey, you know what, I'm really sorry, but I can't continue this conversation in my current mental state. Give me 10 minutes and I'll come back, or whatever it is. But I think it's okay to disengage too, because we're all human. How are you not going to get, antagonized? Like, that's normal. Like, if you're not, you're a robot. So all that to say that I think, at the end of the day, be direct, look for those one-on-one relationships. And if you're actually trying to solve for something, then get off of social media.
Thank you, Hosea.
Hey, Katherine, since I didn't answer the question originally, may I do a short answer to it?
Sure. And then we'll go over to Jose.
Oh, I'm sorry. Jose, I'll go after you. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Steve. Go ahead.
Well, Hosea was reminding me of a little practice that I try to do with my readers at the Washington Post. And so I get a lot of emails that are critical. I'll put it that way. Some are outside of the boundaries, as Amanda would put it, and I don't deal with them. Those that are threatening violence or using language that's profane. But there are a lot that just express anger and confusion, and they direct it at me. And what I try to do is write them back and write like, "Hi, Katherine." So I name them. I let them know that I am seeing them, and then I say, I'm really not sure what your beef was with me. Could you explain it in a different way and talk to me, not about like who you think I am, but what the substantive part is. And it's not a scientific experiment, but I would say 2 out of 3 times I get a response back. "Oh, hey, Stephen, I didn't think you were actually a human being who read these things. Let me talk to you." And what I have taken away from that is we are so hungry to be seen and to be recognized, by our friends, by others in our communities. And that is a strategy I think that also can really work for all of us when we're playing within the safe sandbox.
Yeah, so important. And that's something we need to remember, for ourselves, but also for others. Again, back to the concept or the theme about humanizing or dehumanizing, that when we're dehumanizing, we're not seeing each other's humanity. So thank you, Stephen, for that. And Jose, please contribute your most effective strategies.
Well, so I have to do this, that is engage across differences for a living, because I'm a trial lawyer. And one of the things that means is that I have to be able to speak to total strangers and have them listen to me. Jurors will come into a courthouse who I've never met before, and in a matter of a couple of weeks, they'll have the fate of my client's case in their hands. So I need to engage them and speak to them where they are. You're never going to win a jury trial by asking someone to set aside their life experiences and decide it, contrary to that. And the way the jury selection works is there's virtually assures that there's going to be almost no one on the jury who will ever identify with me in the ordinary course. So the strategy that I employ with jurors, but I've also taken to use in other aspects of my life, it's two parts. One of them is something that Amanda's talked about, which is trying to understand them individually and finding the common experience that we share. What I think Amanda referred to as mutual recognition, which is a great phrase, and I'm going to shamelessly steal that. That's because we have far more in common as people than the differences that we focus on. When you deploy this in the arena of civil discourse, you are listening, you're learning. And once you understand who you're talking to, it becomes so much easier to have a civil discussion with them. It's harder to be uncivil to someone that you identify with on some level. And there is something that we can all identify on. And I just encourage people to find those things in people. And just imagine the quality of our discussions if people put half as much energy into finding the common as they do expounding on the differences between groups.
Great. Thanks, Jose. And experience well earned as a trial lawyer. And, I think that idea of listening deeply and listening for, what could we agree with? What do we agree with? And starting with that and using that as a building block to navigate the disagreements, I think is a very effective strategy. So thank you, everyone. You've shared great strategies. We'd love to hear from you in the audience. What have you found to be most effective as you're engaging respectfully and effectively across differences? We've had so much lively chats, lively conversation happening. So we're going to turn to some of your questions. And so we'll start off with, there's been a lot of discussion about social media. So I want to dig a little bit more into this and open it up to anyone in the panel to talk about. Stephen, you've already brought it up several times. So thinking about, has civil discourse degraded due to social media and the fact that on social media or in the letters that you're getting, Stephen, that we're not face to face. And it's easy to forget that this other person isn't just a robot, as you said, it's a real person with feelings and experiences and responses to what we're saying. So, has it degraded? And really, what is, more broadly, what is the impact of social media on civil discourse? Who would like to start us off?
I'll jump in for just a brief moment on this. As the father of 3 teenagers right now, there's very little good that I can say about social media and its impact on the quality of discussion on anything. I don't know that social media created the problem. We've been uncivil at various times in our country's history, before anyone ever invented a cell phone. But I think the problem is it's hard to get away from it now. People are always on their phones. They're always looking at this stuff. And unless you do the experience of a social media cleanse where you actually just get away for a couple of weeks, you don't realize just how much it actually plays in your consciousness and in your mind. So I view it as primarily an obstacle, and very difficult to think of it as even a potential part of the solution.
Okay, thanks, Jose. Someone else?
I can jump in. My class, actually, I did a lecture on Ida B. Wells and her anti-lynching campaign. And we talked about, would Ida B. Wells like social media or would she hate it, right? Because you can get, we actually did a pros and cons list, right? So the pros was that social media is very democratizing in the sense that there's a very low barrier to entry. And again, on the other hand of that, there's a very low barrier to entry. So you can get a lot of information that you wouldn't have access to before. And facts are good, like actual facts. But then you also have, selection bias with the sort of media you consume. You have the circulation of misinformation. You have anonymous, a lot of folks hiding under a cloak of anonymity, including in this chat. I see you. You just have so many challenges and bots and that sort of stuff. So I think that it definitely amplifies a lot of problems, and it allows those problems to have a wider reach in terms of, for example, misinformation and folks literally being able to live in an alternate reality because they're able to select exclusively what they consume. But it also has a lot of potential in terms of your exposure to a wider range of thought, a wider range of people who are sincerely seeking new information. So I can see both sides.
Good. Yeah, I was curious to see if we were going to hear some positives as well as some negatives. So thanks for highlighting those, Amanda. Who wants to jump in?
Well, can we address this question that just came up? The question's from Amanda Jaffe. Yes, the discussion veered away from Stephen's baseline discussion defining civil discourse. Panelists seem to be using the term as a synonym for respectful. I definitely want to jump in on that one. Or Stephen, maybe you want to go first, but the reason why I want to address that is simply because that's definitely not what I'm saying, and if that's what I'm conveying. Respectful is a part of it, I think, but I don't think it's the key. And so the message, if there's only one thing that you take away from, at least from my comments today, is that you need to figure out what the objective here. What are you trying to accomplish when you're having this discussion with somebody? And so in the context of civil discourse, in my mind, so personally, I'll tell you what I think the objective is. And to be clear, this is solely my definition. But at the end of the day, my objective is simply I think it is accomplishing justice, right? I don't think it's about being, even if it's at the cost of being respectful, even if you lose relationships, notwithstanding everything I just said before that, then so be it. But in my mind, respectful is secondary or even tertiary. And when I think of civil discourse.
Thanks, Hosea. Stephen, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I think that's very well said. And I know there have been a lot of comments about what I said at the beginning, and I'm happy to share those remarks with everybody if there's a way that we can do that at the end. But the point I was making was that there are many definitions of what civility is and what civil discourse is. We misuse many of them. We often choose the definition that works for us at a particular time and that is often associated with our privilege, whatever that may be. And as I think as Duke affiliates, we all have some level of privilege, as unequal as that might be. But I don't think that respect is necessarily the answer, as Hosea says there. It might be at baseline respectful engagement, but I think we need to go deeper. And as I asked at the beginning, I don't know that civility or civil discourse is always the goal. And sometimes it's not. Justice may be, equality may be, survival may be. And, how we act matters, but how we evaluate what people do and say needs to be understood, in the larger context, I think.
Okay, so good discussion around what is our objective, what's the goal, is it around that respectful engagement may be a baseline, but ultimately there are certain cause for moving beyond that to advance justice, to advance equity, and sometimes we may have to push respectful engagement aside. All right. Well, Stephen, you just invoked that civil discourse may be associated with privilege. And Amanda, you've also done a great job of really invoking privilege and power in this discussion, which is critical. So wanting to hear from you all about our notions of civility, or how our notions of civility is shaped by class. and/or privilege?
I mean, I think the notion of what is civilization, all of that has clear historical ties and to racism, colonialism, again, class elites being able to manage and dictate poor folks and what is uncivilized. And so power is up and through the history of civility, for sure.
I mean, I have over here 100 books of manners books and etiquette books going back to the 19th century. And by and large, they are meant to emphasize class differences, to emphasize classes, and then to make it safe for people to figure out how to rise up into, the upper classes by, how you would write a thank you note or how you would set a table, and all of these sort of really arcane things that we sometimes also associate with civility. What a beautiful way that you've set your table. Like, that really matters. That may be pretty, but that really doesn't matter. And here in the South, especially, I think, we're experts at this patina of civility. And somebody in the chat reminded me, the phrase, bless your heart, which is probably about the meanest thing you can say to somebody in most cases. It took me a long time as a Northerner to figure that out, but the South is really practiced in this sort of dual level. And I think it comes, from, slavery times, when that was part of the justification. This was a happy family. We were, paternalistic. We were taking care of those folks, and it did not take into account the brutality, the inherent inequality. So we have to be careful about all that.
I'd like us to think about the civility that we're talking about, as to sort of bring it back full circle, to be not the politeness, not the patina that that Stephen's talking about. Recognizing that that someone gets to write the standards, and we don't want to be bound by those. However you want to refer to it, and there are lots of different ways you can refer to it. We live in a white normed culture, and I don't think that we should. I think it's the ultimate act of civil discourse to recognize that and to see what are the other contributions that haven't been heard, and to bring those into the discussion. I think the civility politeness thing, that's getting us away from the point. And it is the norm. And obviously the norm isn't working. Just look around. Politeness is even out the window. So recognizing the role that class and power play in what writing the rules is very important. But we can even have that discussion in a civil way, not polite, but civil, where we actually engage on the differences and the ideas rather than reducing it to name calling, which just doesn't advance the progress at all.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks, Jose, for that reminder. We're not talking about all of your books. Again, the patina of decorum and civility. And I think what we're hearing now is some conversation, and we're getting towards this. Who writes the standards of civility? Who determines what is civility? And, invoking white supremacy culture, certainly kind of the historical and present day role that has played in setting the rules, setting the standard. Anyone operating outside of that then not being considered civil or a civilist. So who wants to talk about that? And even your experience of that. Again, I think the richness of this discussion comes from the diverse experiences and perspectives that everyone here is bringing to this conversation.
Well, I think historically in the U.S., it's been, wealthy white males have dictated, they've been of the people in power in society. And so the civility and the concept of what is appropriate, what is inappropriate, what is within the bounds of the law, and what needs to be disciplined because it's not within the bounds of the law has been dictated by, wealthier white males. And so we see that throughout society, whether it's, racialized programs like, throwing Indigenous children into boarding schools, if it's, the punishment that women face for, trying to step out of the home and work, whether it's, even some of the criticisms of struggles for racial equality today. A lot of that has been dictated by folks who have historically been in power, and that's whether or not they're the actual majority. But that's what it's been in the US. And of course, it varies with the way that power is distributed in other societies. So it might be class and color. It might be a particular ethnicity or even a racial minority, for example, in a place like apartheid South Africa, right? So it changes over, but that's what happens. Civility is a social construct, right? And so it'll change from society to society. It'll change over time, over place. So it's complicated, but it has that common thread of like the people in power dictate what it is and what it isn't.
Amanda, I agree entirely. I would just add in that into that sort of constellation of people who are in power, the heteronormative aspect of that and how sexual identity plays into that as well.
Absolutely.
Religion as well. So many axes of difference depending on the society, for sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Who's in power? Who's privileged? What is privileged is so kind of culturally specific and variable depending on the cultural context. So thank you for invoking that kind of global reference there, Amanda, recognition of different cultural standards.
And I think, we've talked a little bit about power, and especially you have, Amanda. And, I think back to these sort of cultural definitions that, that have been established by those in power. And then when you have other groups who are trying to redefine perhaps how they want to be identified or called or redefined in any way, that's where you get into this power struggle, because those who have been in charge really like having that power to set the rules, set the language, and so on. And so any challenge of that is really a much deeper challenge than the superficial one than it can appear to be.
Yeah, I just wanted to invoke someone in the chat had talked about demonizing the norm. And I don't feel that that's what we're doing here, demonizing the norm. I think what we're doing is deconstructing the norm and really understanding when we say norm, who sets that norm? How did they get to set it? And questioning and exploring whose norm and whose standard and how did we get here and how can we recognize that there are variable norms, that there is no one standard of humanity that, again, in historic and present day has been really set by white people and hence the reality of white supremacy culture. So we're not demonizing, we're deconstructing. And I think that's a big difference. So Hosea and Jose, I want to see if you all want to contribute to this engaging topic.
I'll turn it over to Hosea because I think I've acknowledged what I think it would be very difficult to argue otherwise, that in a white norm culture, and as Stephen correctly identified, not just white, but white male heterosexual culture, the rules get written in the way that they're most comfortable with. So rather than try to come up with something else on that, I'd be interested in Hosea's take on it.
No, I agree with everything. I feel like I don't have too much to add there, except to say, even again, going back to the Asian American community in terms of what the model minority myth is, right? Same thing. It's a label that's been ascribed upon our community. And so again, I think we're all talking about the same themes here, manifesting in different ways.
Okay. Yeah, one nuance to this conversation about norms, there have been a number of comments about code switching. Which, again, speaks to that notion of norm and the way that people with different identities who aren't part of the majority, the power majority, have engage in code switching. And so just wondering if anyone wants to speak to the relationship between code switching and civil discourse and norm setting. Okay. So just want to invite the panelists, what are reading through some of the chats. I know they're coming in fast and furious, which is great. We're super excited that you all are so engaged. We are also. And, oh, sorry, someone asking what code switching is. So, code switching in which people are either unconsciously or consciously changing the ways in which they speak in order to fit in with the dominant culture, or with what is considered to be kind of appropriate and normative behavior. So often has been talked about by and about African Americans and Black people in the U.S. And I would expand that, thinking intersectionally about the ways that LGBTQ plus people code switch in order to fit in with heteronormative culture and expectations to, not talk about our partner openly at work, or not use pronouns in order to identify that our partner may be of the same gender, et cetera, in order to fit into, again, the dominant culture. Anyone else is welcome to add to that.
I think well said, Katherine.
Okay. So another question.
We've all been invited to a dinner party, the five of us. Thank you to that. We're not in the same place, unfortunately.
Great. Who's cooking?
I don't know who that was, but that was very generous. I saw, I think Karen Carey, but I may be wrong about the name, who was identifying being 80 years old and talking a little bit about generational issues, which, I think I would like to put on the floor, in part because it's something that I've been studying in the book that I just wrote, which looks at ageism and how in many ways that concept, the language around that remains acceptable to many people. And I think of from birthday cards to the depiction of older people as being incompetent when it comes to technology, or their hearing is gone, and so on. And and all of these are ways also that we use words and we use metaphors that that are hurtful and that often we're not even aware of. I think we're more aware of many of the other issues at this point, no matter where we fall out on that spectrum. But it was surprising to me how oblivious many people are when it comes to age-related issues.
Absolutely. This is such a big topic of conversation in the workplace when we're having 5 generations in the workplace for the first time ever, and just kind of a recognition and how to engage in a respectful conversation and understanding across generations. And oftentimes it's operating, but people aren't speaking it and naming what's happening, that these could be generational differences. All right. So a question that came in is about, I know we only have a couple more minutes to hear from you all before we start to close out. So I just want to throw it out to you all for final words, some questions about how do we move from theory to practice? How do we teach the next generation? I think we have our own work to do around learning how to engage in practice civil discourse. And we have a lot to learn from younger people as well, from our own kids. I know my son has taught me so much. So I want to throw it open to you all for your final words. Let's go ahead and hear from you, Amanda.
Sure. I just wanted, at the outset of the conversation, I just wanted to drive home the idea that our notion of what is civil and what isn't is always, it's always sort of built into the context of history and power. And we can't really separate that, right? Again, it's greater than just, being kind, nice and polite, as Stephen has told us, but really getting to the heart of the matter. What is our call for civil discourse enabling us to see? And what is it concealing if we are solely sort of concentrating on the discourse part rather than the sort of structural conditions that it reflects.
Great. Thank you, Amanda. And Hosea?
For me, I think at the end of the day, I'm going to reiterate what I said earlier, in that it comes, because I'm looking at the chat again, I see Hank Lemieux's question or his comment about, if we went to Duke, so we can change ourselves, but there's only 0.001% of the population. I push back a little bit on that, right? Because that goes back to what I was saying earlier about we're thinking too broadly. We're thinking of the solution before we're getting way ahead of ourselves here. I think we got to take things a step at a time. You guys are gonna think all I do is watch movies and quote movies and stuff, but one of my favorite movies is The Martian with Matt Damon. And at the end of it, spoiler alert, if you still haven't seen it, I don't really apologize since it's been out for a while, but at the end when he survives and he's lecturing to a classroom, someone asked him, how'd you survive? Like, how'd you pull it off? And he said, I just solved one problem and then I solved the next problem and then I solved the next problem and next thing I knew I made it back on Earth. And I think that applies here as well. In that I think everyone's just jumping ahead. Like someone else had an interesting question about like, how would you, if like a racist person was talking with an anti-racist person, how would they get along? And like, it's an interesting thought experiment. It's an interesting thought, a question of sorts. But I think practically though, I think it somewhat misses the point again, right? I think at the end of the day, simply put, just engage with your community, engage with the people around you, find someone that's a little different from you and learn from them. I don't know what's going to come out of that. I'm not promising now all of a sudden we'll all get together and everyone's going to be happy and we'll sing kumbaya. That's not what I'm saying. Having said that though, I think let's not actually start, somewhat ironically, let's not start with the end in mind. Let's just start with the basics and just see what happens from there.
Thanks, Hosea. Jose?
Well, I'll tag on to that because the chat has convinced me that there's a lot of despair out there about whether or not this is attainable. And I just remind everyone of the old saying that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. If we take it upon ourselves to engage in civil discourse, to model that behavior, over time, that's the only way to solve. We didn't get ourselves here, overnight. It didn't happen when Trump was elected. And it's not going to go away because, Biden's the president or anything like that. We have so much work to do on this. Let's just roll up our sleeves and take it individual responsibility. And amongst the people that we're close to, call it out when we see the bad behavior. Let people know it's not okay. And, over time, that's how things happen. That's how progress gets made.
Great. One step at a time. Thanks, Jose. Stephen?
I'll just share a little practice that I've developed. And it comes from meditating, but you don't have to be a meditator to do this. But one of the things I've learned is before responding in a situation to take a pause, which may just be a breath or two, and either to think or to feel, how do you want to respond in that situation? And sometimes that means, do I say this or do I say that? Do I try to be kinder? Do I try to be more truthful? But it gives me that moment. Sometimes it has meant challenging, just what Jose was saying, challenging what was said. And I kind of need that moment to collect myself and find a way to say it that is not necessarily disrespectful, but has equivalent weight as was just presented. And without sort of going nuclear on that. But I think, taking that pause and sort of going into yourself and saying, how do I want to be? How do I want to be today? How do I want to be tomorrow? What impact will that have on those around me? I think that is a way that we start to change this culture. We've seen good times in terms of civility and civil discourse. We've seen worse times. So it's not as though it's preordained that we are just going down the tubes here. We have 400 people right here who care about this topic as much as disagreement as there's been in the chat. All of you care about that. We care about that. That's why we're here. That's how this starts, I think.
Agreed. Thank you, Stephen. Let's take a breath. So we want to thank you all so much for joining us. We're going to be asking you some polls, so please stay on because we want to ask you a few questions about your interest in future programs like this. So you should see on your screen right now a future programming poll. We want to find out from you, are you interested in participating in another Duke program on civil discourse? Will this be the last or the first of many? And also, are you wanting to engage in civil discourse on specific topics, or do you want to keep it general? And then we provided you with a number of topics. If there's a topic that we missed, please feel free to put it in the chat. We will be we're recording the chat, and we will review that afterwards to look at other topics that you all may be interested in, if you're interested in participating again. But I also want to recognize, like Stephen, about just the sheer number, almost 450 people, over 1,000 participated tonight, over 1,000 people registered. Clearly, this is an important topic, and this is only our Duke community, and it's just a small piece of the world. And so, and thinking about the impact that conversations like this can really have around the world, and we do have participants from all over our earth. So, I want to really thank our panelists, Amanda Boston, Hosea Chang, Hosea Isasi, and Stephen Petrow. Thank you so much. And also the Duke Alumni Engagement and Development, Jess Emig, Andy Scott, Claribel Peguero, and everyone else in the Duke team. Thank you so much, as well as all 4 of the affinity groups who enthusiastically said yes to this conversation. So again, we really appreciate you, our audience, for joining us. And thanks so much for your incredible questions, comments, arguments, hopefully always respectful, and most of all, advancing justice and equity.